The shot was the only punctuation that mattered. In the dusty, sun-bleached theater of Redemption Creek, the crack of a Colt revolver was an exclamation point, a period, and a question mark all at once. For Elias Vance, it was the sound of a past he had buried 6 feet deep, clawing its way back to the surface. He was standing at the counter of Miller's Mercantile, a sack of flour and a tin of coffee. His only ambition for the day, when the midday quiet was shattered. 2 men burst through the batwing doors of the bank across the street, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. A third stood guard on the boardwalk, a Winchester held with casual menace. It was professional, Elias noted, with a cold, detached part of his mind, the part that had once worn a U.S. Marshal's star. No wasted motion, no panicked shouting. Just the clean, brutal efficiency of men who knew their trade. The townsfolk, paralyzed by the sudden violence, froze like startled deer. They flattened themselves against walls, dove behind water troughs, and melted into doorways. Elias, however, remained still, his hand hovering near the sack of flour. He was no longer the law. He had surrendered that right, that burden, on the day his own bullet had gone astray and extinguished the life of an innocent man. He was just a rancher now, a man seeking the absolution of solitude on a small patch of unforgiving land. He had no stake in this town's money. But then the leader of the outlaws emerged from the bank. He was a tall man dressed in black, from his dusty boots to his wide-brimmed hat. He moved with a languid, predatory grace that set him apart from his thuggish companions. He carried a heavy saddlebag of stolen money, but his eyes, cold and dark above his bandana, weren't scanning the street for threats. They were fixed directly on Elias. A chill colder than any mountain winter snaked down Elias's spine. This wasn't random. The world seemed to slow, the frantic sounds of the street fading to a dull roar. The man in black walked with unnerving purpose, not towards his horse, but straight across the street, directly towards the Mercantile. His men exchanged nervous glances, but held their positions. Their leader was a man they clearly feared more than any lawman. Elias's hand, which had been resting on the counter, slowly fell to his side, his fingers instinctively curling near the worn grip of the peacemaker holstered on his hip. He was a ghost in this town, a quiet man who kept to himself. No one knew his name or his past. So why was this killer looking at him as if they were old acquaintances? The man in black stopped just outside the Mercantile's entrance, the afternoon sun casting his long shadow over Elias. He gestured with his chin. "You, Vance, step out." The name hit Elias like a physical blow. No one had called him Vance in 3 years. He was Elias Smith, here a name as plain and forgettable as he could make it. Hearing his true name spoken by this outlaw felt like a desecration of the quiet life he had so carefully constructed. Elias didn't move. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Answering the summons meant acknowledging a past he'd renounced. Ignoring it was not an option. The outlaw's lips curled into a sneer that was visible even beneath the cloth. "Don't make me ask again, Marshal." The title was a drop of poison spat with contempt. Slowly, Elias turned and walked towards the door. His movements measured his body, a coiled spring of readiness. He stepped out onto the boardwalk, the harsh sunlight making him squint. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sweat, and fear. He stood face to face with the outlaw, close enough to see the chilling lack of emotion in the man's eyes. They were the eyes of a hangman. "I don't know you," Elias said, his voice a low, rusty growl from disuse. "But I know you," the man replied, his voice a smooth, cold baritone. "I know everything about you. I know about the star you threw in the dust. I know about the nights you spent staring into a bottle. And I know about Sarah." The name of his late wife on this man's lips was a violation. A white-hot rage, an emotion Elias thought he had buried alongside her, surged through him. His hand twitched. "What do you want?" Elias bit out the words, sharp as flint. The outlaw didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his own vest pocket and produced a small, tarnished silver object. With a flick of his thumb, he flipped it open. It was a pocket watch, and inside the cover was a small, exquisitely detailed photograph. A woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This was my mother," the outlaw said, his voice losing none of its coldness. "She died of a broken heart, a sickness for which there is no cure, Marshal. You should know something about that." He snapped the watch shut. "You see, grief is a strange thing. It can crush a man, or it can forge him into something new, something harder." He took a deliberate step closer, invading Elias's space. His gaze dropped to the pocket of Elias's denim jacket, where the faint outline of a small round object was visible. A man who loses everything needs something to hold on to. A memory. A trinket. With a movement so swift, it was almost a blur, the outlaw's hand shot out. He didn't reach for Elias's gun. He plunged his fingers into Elias's jacket pocket and ripped out the silver locket that hung on a chain around his neck. The chain snapped, biting into Elias's skin. The locket was Elias's only remaining connection to his wife, Sarah. Inside was her tiny hand-painted portrait, the only image he had left of her. It was his penance, his solace, the anchor of his shattered life. He stared at the locket, now resting in the outlaw's gloved hand. He had taken the bank's money, terrorized the town. But this was the real robbery. "This is not about money." Elias rasped, a terrifying understanding dawning. "Money is a tool, a means to an end." The outlaw set his eyes glittering with a dark, triumphant fire. This is the beginning of the lesson." He coolly pocketed the locket. "My name is Silas Blackwood. I suggest you remember it." He turned, and with a sharp whistle to his men, swung up onto his horse. As the gang spurred their mounts and galloped out of town in a cloud of dust and chaos, Silas Blackwood looked back one last time. He didn't look at the bank or the terrified townsfolk. He looked directly at Elias Vance, a silent promise of future torment passing between them. Elias stood frozen on the boardwalk, the broken chain cool against his neck. The town's money was gone. But Blackwood had stolen something infinitely more valuable. He had stolen the ghost of Sarah, and in doing so, he had resurrected the U.S. Marshal Elias Vance had tried so desperately to kill. The quiet life was over. The hunt had begun. The dust settled over Redemption Creek, leaving behind a silence more profound than the noise it had replaced. Elias stood amidst the aftermath, a statue of quiet fury. The townsfolk slowly emerged from their hiding places, their whispers a nervous hum. Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine was as soft as his belly, finally waddled out of his office, his face a mask of practiced concern. He saw the open vault of the bank, then his eyes landed on Elias. He saw not a victim, but a problem. Elias ignored them all. He turned without a word and strode to the livery stable. The pursuit was not a choice. It was a compulsion. Blackwood had not just stolen a piece of silver. He had deliberately unlatched the door to Elias's private hell and invited himself in. As he saddled his horse, a stoic buckskin named Cicero, his mind worked with the cold precision he had long suppressed. This wasn't a simple robbery. It was a message, an overture to a symphony of pain that Blackwood clearly intended to compose with Elias as the lead instrument. He rode out of town under the suspicious gaze of the sheriff and the fearful stares of the citizens. He left the main road within a mile, guiding Cicero onto the endless expanse of sun-bleached salt flats, where heat shimmered like ghosts on the horizon. This was his world, the one he understood. Not the world of settlements and false civilities, but the raw, honest landscape of pursuit and survival. He tracked them not by sight, but by the subtle language of the earth, the fresh-cut edges of hoofprints in the alkali dust, a carelessly discarded cigar butt, the unnatural disturbance of a flock of desert sparrows. As he rode, the silence was filled with the ghosts of his own making. The image of his wife Sarah, her smile as warm as the prairie sun, flickered in his mind. He had met her in a small town just like Redemption Creek, a place he was passing through on the trail of a different kind of monster. She had seen past the star on his chest and the hardness in his eyes, finding the man beneath. Her love had been a brief, beautiful spring in the long winter of his life. Her death from a fever 2 years into their marriage had been the first great shattering. The locket was all he had left of that warmth, a fragile shield against the encroaching cold. The second shattering had come years later. It was a botched raid on a counterfeiting ring outside of St. Louis. Gunfire had erupted in a crowded market. Elias had fired at his target, a desperate man using a bystander as a shield. His shot had been perfect, deadly. But in the split second he pulled the trigger, the target had stumbled. The bullet passed through the criminal and struck the shield a young homesteader named Thomas, a man who had come to town for nothing more than a sack of seed corn. He died instantly. Elias could still see the look of stunned surprise in the young man's eyes, a look that had haunted his every waking moment since. The marshal's service called it a justifiable tragedy. Elias called it a failure of his soul. He had turned in his badge the next day, trading the law for the silent judgment of the wilderness. Now a man named Blackwood had dragged that failure back into the light. The name meant nothing to him. But the calculation in the man's eyes, the personal nature of the theft, it spoke of a connection Elias couldn't yet grasp. He pushed Cicero harder, the setting sun painting the blood-red mesas in jagged silhouettes against a turquoise sky. The land was beautiful and deadly, a perfect reflection of the man he was becoming once again. By nightfall, he reached Redemption Creek's outer limits, a collection of desperate homesteads clinging to life by a thread. The town itself was a festering wound. In the middle of this vastness, a place controlled by a single source of power, a rancher named Silas Blackwood. It took Elias a moment to connect the name of the bank robber with the name of the region's cattle baron. It seemed impossible. Why would a man who owned the largest ranch, the local sheriff, and half the businesses in town need to rob his own bank? It made no sense unless the money was never the point. Elias had heard the whispers about Blackwood in town. He was a newer arrival to the territory, having bought the massive Circle B ranch a year ago. He was respected and feared, a man of wealth and influence, who kept his affairs private. Sheriff Brody was little more than a hired hand, ensuring Blackwood's interests were protected. Elias now understood that the odds were stacked against him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He wasn't just chasing an outlaw. He was challenging a king in his own kingdom. The entire town, knowingly or not, was an extension of Silas Blackwood's power. He was utterly alone. The trail left by Blackwood's gang was deceptively easy to follow, almost as if they weren't concerned with pursuit. They skirted the edge of Blackwood's own sprawling ranch lands and headed deeper into the Badlands, a maze of canyons and arroyos. As the moon rose, casting the landscape in an ethereal skeletal light, Elias saw a flicker of orange against a distant rock face. A campfire. He dismounted, tethering Cicero in a thicket of mesquite, and proceeded on foot, his boots making no sound on the sandy earth. As he drew closer, he saw that the camp was at a small, isolated homestead, a sad little cabin, and a dilapidated corral tucked into a box canyon. It was the last place a man would settle unless he had no other choice. A place to disappear. The trail of Blackwood's gang led directly to it. But as Elias crept to the edge of the ridge overlooking the small homestead, he knew something was wrong. There was no laughter, no sentries, only the lonely crackle of a dying fire. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of fresh blood. This wasn't a camp. It was an echo of violence. The cabin door hung open on a single leather hinge, a dark, gaping mouth. Elias scanned the area, his martial senses on high alert. No movement. No sound but the wind whispering through the sagebrush. He descended the ridge, his peacemaker now drawn the cold steel, a familiar weight in his hand. He moved towards the homestead, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind a potential warning. He was walking into a trap, he was sure of it. But what choice did he have? The answer to why Blackwood had targeted him lay somewhere in that darkness, and Elias Vance would walk through the gates of hell itself to get it back. The scene at the homestead was a quiet testament to brutality. The fire was little more than a pile of glowing embers, casting just enough light to reveal the deep, gouging tracks of shod horses that had torn up the yard before riding away. The place had been raided, but not for supplies. The small vegetable patch was trampled, the water barrel kicked over its precious contents, seeping into the thirsty ground. It was an act of pure, malicious destruction. The family who lived here, whose meager existence was etched into this small patch of dirt, was gone. Elias moved through the scene with a grim economy of motion, his eyes cataloging the details. He found a child's small wooden toy, a roughly carved horse lying half-buried in the dirt. He nudged it with the toe of his boot, a familiar ache of loss twisting in his gut. Blackwood's message was becoming clearer. He wasn't just coming for Elias. He was a plague that would destroy everything he touched. Then he heard it. A low groan barely audible over the wind. It came from behind the ruined corral. Elias raised his pistol, his thumb resting on the hammer, and moved toward the sound. Sprawled in the dirt, half hidden by a collapsed section of fencing, was a man. He was Native American, his face a chiseled mask of pain, his long black hair matted with dust and blood. He was dressed in simple buckskin leggings and a torn cotton shirt. A deep, ugly gash ran across his ribs, bleeding sluggishly. He'd been shot, but from the bruising and a fresh laceration on his cheek, it was clear he'd put up a hell of a fight before being overwhelmed. Elias kept his gun level. In this territory, any lone native was viewed with suspicion, often with open hostility. The Apache were restless, and any act of violence was immediately laid at their feet. But this man didn't look like a raider. He looked like a defender. His knuckles were raw and split, and the ground around him was scuffed from a desperate struggle. He had been trying to protect this place. The wounded man's eyes flickered open. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a defiant fire that even his agony could not extinguish. He saw Elias, the gun the hard set of his jaw, and a flicker of resignation passed over his face. He made no plea, no sound. He simply waited for the final bullet. And in that moment, Elias was faced with a choice. The logical part of him, the survivor, said to walk away. This man was not his problem. Getting involved would only complicate his pursuit of Blackwood, draw unwanted attention. The world was full of dying men. But another voice, the ghost of the marshal he once was, spoke of a different kind of logic. An old code, tarnished but not broken, whispered that you don't leave a man to die in the dirt, no matter the color of his skin. It was that same code that had led him to fire the shot that killed Thomas. But it was the only thing he had left that separated him from men like Blackwood. Damn it. Elias muttered to himself, the curse a quiet admission of defeat. He holstered his pistol. He knelt beside the man, who watched his every move with wary intensity. "I'm not going to hurt you." Elias said the words, feeling clumsy and inadequate. He tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt and pressed it against the wound. The man flinched, but didn't cry out. His stoicism was unnerving. Getting him into the cabin was a grueling effort. The man was lean but solid muscle, a dead weight that tested Elias's strength. He half-dragged, half-carried him inside, laying him gently on the single straw mattress that lay on the floor. In the gloom of the cabin, Elias lit a small lantern he found on the table. The meager light revealed the poverty of the family that had lived here, and the strength of the man lying before him. His body was a tapestry of old scars, each one telling a story of a life lived at the sharp end of existence. Elias searched the cabin and found a small box of medical supplies, a bottle of whiskey, a few clean rags, and a needle and thread. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He cleaned the wound as best he could, the whiskey earning him a sharp intake of breath, but no other sound from the injured man. The bullet had passed clean through a small mercy. He stitched the wound with clumsy but effective sutures, his hands surprisingly steady. As he worked, he felt the man's eyes on him, studying him with an unnerving perception. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels exhausted. He had set a fire in the small hearth, and the warm light pushed back the darkness. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was a conversation in itself, a careful dance of assessment and mistrust. Finally, the man pushed himself up on one elbow, his face tight with pain. "Why?" he asked. His English was perfect, precise, carrying only the faintest trace of an accent. The single word held a universe of questions. "The men who did this to you." Elias said, his voice flat. "They were led by a man in black. Calls himself Silas Blackwood." The man's eyes narrowed at the name. A flicker of recognition and something else, a deep, cold hatred. "Blackwood." He repeated the name like a stone in his mouth. "His shadow poisons the land." "He and I have business," Elias said. "They passed through here. I need to know which way they went." The man looked at him then, around the small empty cabin. The family. A man, a woman, a small child. They were good people. They gave me water when I was weak. I was helping them mend their roof. His voice was heavy with a grief that felt far more personal than that of a passing stranger. Blackwood's men came at dusk. They said the land belonged to their boss. When the homesteader refused to leave, He didn't need to finish. The silence spoke of the unspeakable. I tried to stop them. And where did they take the family? Elias asked, a cold dread creeping into him. The man shook his head, slumping back onto the mattress. They do not take prisoners, not the ones who defy them. He gestured weakly to the west towards the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. Blackwood's men rode that way, towards the old silver mine, the one they call the Devil's Maw. You know him then. Blackwood. Elias stated not a question. I know what he takes. The man said, his gaze distant. He takes the land. He takes the water. He takes the lives of anyone who stands in his way, white or native. He is a sickness. He looked at Elias, his dark eyes seeming to pierce through the layers of guilt and weariness that surrounded him. You hunt him for what he stole from you. I hunt him for what he is. In that moment, their separate quests merged. They were two men from different worlds, stripped of everything they held dear by the same enemy. I'm Elias Vance. Elias said, offering his real name for the first time in years. It felt like shedding a skin. The man considered this for a moment. Then, with a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the small cabin, he replied, "My people call me Kale." A grudging alliance was formed in that blood-stained cabin, a partnership born of shared loss and a common desire for justice. Kyle, once he was able to stand, insisted on leaving. His wound was still raw, but his warrior spirit refused to be coddled. They left the homestead at dawn, a silent makeshift grave for the family that had shown a stranger kindness and paid the ultimate price. As they rode west, Kyle's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He saw signs Elias would have missed: a broken branch, a disturbed rock, the faint scent of horse on the wind. He moved through the wilderness with a quiet confidence that spoke of a lifetime spent reading its secrets. Their conversations were sparse, but each word carried weight. Elias learned that Kale was not Apache, but from a smaller, more nomadic tribe that had been all but wiped out, first by disease, then by the relentless encroachment of settlers. He was a man, without a people, a ghost, haunting the lands that had once been his. "Blackwood is not a simple cattleman," Kale said one evening as they shared a meager meal of jerky and hardtack. "He uses his ranch as a shield, but his true business is fear. He forces small ranchers and homesteaders out, buying their land for pennies on the dollar. He chokes off their water, rustles their cattle. Or worse." "Why?" Elias asked, staring into the flames of their small, smokeless fire. "He's already the richest man in the territory. What's the point? Power is not about having enough." Kyle replied, his voice laced with an ancient weariness. "It is about ensuring no one else has any." Their uneasy truce was shattered 2 days later. They had stopped to water their horses at a small hidden spring when they heard the sound of approaching riders. It was a posse led by the unmistakable bulk of Sheriff Brody. They rode with the grim determination of men who believed they were hunting dangerous criminals. "No, Vance." Brody bellowed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "In the name of the law, throw down your weapons. You're under arrest for bank robbery and aiding a fugitive." Elias exchanged a look with Kale. The trap had been sprung. Blackwood hadn't just sicked the law on him. He'd poisoned the well, turning Elias into an outlaw in the eyes of the very people he had once sworn to protect. There was no explaining, no reasoning with men who were on Blackwood's payroll. "There is no law here," Kyle said softly, his hand already on the bow that was his constant companion. "Only Blackwood's will." The first shot came from the posse, kicking up dust near Elias's feet. The time for talking was over. Elias and Kale spurred their horses, diving for the cover of a narrow, rock-strewn canyon just behind them. Bullets ricocheted off the stone walls, the sound of the gunfire deafening in the enclosed space. Blackwood's trap was well laid. The canyon was a bottleneck, a killing ground. Sheriff Brody and his men dismounted, taking up positions at the mouth of the canyon, effectively pinning them in. "Nowhere to run, Vance." Brody shouted, his voice filled with false bravado. "That we cannot stay here." Kyle said, his voice calm amidst the chaos. He had already knocked an arrow, his movements fluid and economical. "This canyon winds for miles, but they will hunt us down." Elias felt the old instincts surge within him. The cold, calculating mind of the marshal took over. He saw the angles, the cover, the weaknesses in the posse's position. A dark, ruthless part of him wanted to take over, to use the deadly skills he possessed, to eliminate the threat, to kill every last one of them. It would be easy. Too easy. But then he looked at Kale. The native warrior was not fighting with rage. He fought with a focused, almost spiritual calm. He loosed an arrow that struck the rifle out of a deputy's hands, the force of the impact spinning the man around. It was a shot meant to disable, not to kill. In Kyle's controlled violence, Elias saw a reflection of the man he wanted to be, not the killer he feared he was becoming again. "Follow me." Elias yelled, his decision made. He spurred Cicero deeper into the canyon, away from the fight. It was a tactical retreat, not a rout. "There's a rock slide up ahead," Elias shouted over the gunfire. "A place where the walls are unstable. We can use it to block the passage." It was a desperate gamble. They galloped through the narrow, twisting passage, the posse's bullets whining past them. The canyon walls grew steeper, the path more treacherous. Elias saw what he was looking for, a section of the cliff face where loose scree and precariously balanced boulders told a story of geological instability. He reined in. Cicero leaped from the saddle and pulled his Winchester from its scabbard. "Kale, keep them busy." Kale didn't need to be told. He sent a volley of arrows towards the pursuing riders, forcing them to take cover. His accuracy was astonishing, each shot a carefully placed deterrent. Elias took aim at the base of the rock slide, at a key cluster of rocks that held the entire, unstable mass in place. He emptied the Winchester, the powerful rifle shots echoing like cannon fire. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groan, the earth began to move. A cascade of pebbles turned into an avalanche of rock and dust. Boulders the size of carriages tumbled down the cliff face, crashing onto the canyon floor with thunderous impact. A massive cloud of dust billowed out, choking the narrow passage. When it cleared, the way behind them was completely blocked by a solid wall of rock and debris. They were safe for now. But they were also trapped on the wrong side of the law, fugitives, in a land ruled by their enemy. They had escaped the physical trap, but Elias knew they had just walked deeper into the moral one Blackwood had set for him. He had chosen not to kill, but in doing so he had cemented his status as an outlaw. He and Kyle were alone, hunted with nothing but their wits and a burning need for justice to see them through the coming storm. Their escape from the canyon bought them time, but it cost them their last shred of legitimacy. They were now officially fugitives, their names and faces likely adorning wanted posters in every settlement from Redemption Creek to Tucson. They traveled by night, resting during the blistering heat of the day, in hidden arroyos and secluded caves. During these long hours, a bond of mutual respect forged in shared adversity grew between them. They were no longer just allies. They were partners in a desperate quest. "This mine, the Devil's Maw," Elias said one evening, cleaning his pistol by the light of a shielded fire. "Why would Blackwood's men go there?" "It is a place of bad spirits, my people say." Kyle replied, stitching a tear in his buckskin leggings with a bone needle. The silver vein ran deep, but it was tainted with arsenic. It poisoned the water and drove the miners mad. The army used it as a supply depot for a time, then abandoned it when the fort was decommissioned. Now only ghosts and outlaws call it home. It is the perfect place for a man like Blackwood to hide his secrets. Their investigation became a hunt for whispers and rumors on the fringes of Blackwood's empire. They gave the towns a wide berth, instead seeking out the isolated prospectors and itinerant traders who lived in the territory's gray areas. It was in one such camp, a collection of grizzled men panning for color in a nearly dry riverbed, that they found their first real clue. They approached the camp cautiously, presenting themselves as men on the run, looking for work. An old prospector named Jedediah, his face a roadmap of desert survival, shared his meager rations and his even more meager gossip. Blackwood. Jedediah rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "He ain't just buying up ranches. He's been buying up worthless claims, places nobody's worked in 50 years. My old partner, he had a claim up near the Dragoons, nothing but rock and rattlesnakes. Blackwood's men came by, offered him cash money for the deed. A fortune for a pile of rocks. Didn't make no sense. "What kind of claims?" Elias asked, keeping his tone casual. "All sorts," the old man said, scratching his beard. "But they all got one thing in common. They follow a straight line running west to east right across the territory, like he's trying to build a fence, but with land deeds instead of barbed wire." Later that night, Elias and Cale discussed the prospector's words. A line of worthless land deeds. It was a puzzle without a solution. A land grab for its own sake seemed illogical even for a man as greedy as Blackwood. "He is not buying the land," Kyle mused, tracing a line in the dirt with a stick. "He is buying what is under it, or what he thinks is under it." Their search for answers led them to the Territorial Records Office in a larger town 60 miles south of Redemption Creek. It was a risky move, but necessary. Under the cover of darkness, Elias, using skills he hadn't employed in years, picked the lock on the back door while Cale stood watch. Inside, amidst the musty smell of aging paper, they found what they were looking for. In a dusty ledger, they found the records of the land purchases Jedediah had spoken of. Dozens of transactions over the past year, all made by a proxy company owned by Silas Blackwood. The properties were indeed worthless on the surface, but as Elias pored over an old survey map, he saw the pattern. The line of properties perfectly corresponded with the path of an old forgotten Spanish silver trail, a route rumored to lead to a legendary lost mine. That wasn't the discovery that made his blood run cold. It was a name. On one of the oldest deeds for a small failed homestead right in the middle of the line was the signature of the original owner from 5 years prior. The name was Jacob Blackwood, and beneath it as a witness to the sale was the signature of his younger brother, who had come to visit from back east, Thomas Blackwood. Elias stared at the name, the ink a faded brown against the yellowed paper. Thomas Blackwood, the innocent man he had killed. The coincidence was too great, too impossible. The world tilted on its axis, and the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a new terrifying picture. Silas Blackwood's vendetta wasn't against a random marshal. His elaborate scheme, his cruelty, his theft of the locket, it was all rooted in that single tragic gunshot fired 3 years ago. Silas wasn't his real name. It was an alias. He was Thomas Blackwood's brother. "Kyle," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's not after money. He's not after land." Cale looked from the deed to Elias's pale, stricken face. The quiet understanding in his eyes told Elias that he saw the truth as well. "He's after you," Cale finished softly. The revelation hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. This entire ordeal, from the moment Blackwood had stepped out of that bank, was a meticulously crafted instrument of revenge. The robbery was theater. The land grab was a smokescreen. The true prize was Elias's soul. Silas Blackwood had spent 3 years building an empire of pain, all to orchestrate the systematic destruction of the man who had taken his brother. He didn't want Elias dead. He wanted him to suffer, to lose everything just as he had. The stolen locket was not a trophy. It was the first piece of Elias's life that Silas had taken, a symbol of the happiness Elias had destroyed for the Blackwood family. He was a man not driven by greed, but by a grief so profound it had twisted into a monstrous, all-consuming obsession. They rode from the records office in silence, the rising sun seeming to mock the darkness that had enveloped Elias's world. The trail to the Devil's Maw was no longer just a path to a confrontation. It was a journey to his own day of reckoning. He was not hunting a villain anymore. He was hunting a ghost of his own, making a man whose entire existence was a monument to Elias's greatest failure. The Devil's Maw was a scar on the face of the mountains, a dark gaping wound in the red rock. The abandoned silver mine was exactly as Cale had described it, a place of profound desolation surrounded by the skeletal remains of old mining equipment and the graves of men who had succumbed to its poison. A plume of smoke rising from a hidden chimney was the only sign that this place of death was now inhabited. Elias and Cale left their horses a mile away and approached on foot using the terrain for cover. They scaled a ridge that overlooked the mine's entrance, a heavily fortified gate made of rough-hewn timber. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their vigilance a clear sign that Blackwood was expecting company. "This is not a hideout." Elias observed, his voice grim. "It's a fortress." "He has been preparing for this day for a long time," Kyle said. "This is his stage." They waited until nightfall, slipping past the patrols under the cover of a moonless sky. Their goal was not a full-scale assault, but a reckoning. Elias needed to face Blackwood to hear the truth from his own lips. They found a ventilation shaft higher up the mountain, a narrow, dark passage that led deep into the earth. It was a treacherous descent, but it bypassed the main gates. Inside the mine was a labyrinth of tunnels eerily lit by lanterns placed at regular intervals. The air was cold and damp, tasting of arsenic and stale earth. They could hear the distant sounds of men's voices, the clink of glasses, the coarse laughter of Blackwood's private army. They followed the sounds to a large central cavern where the main mining operations had once taken place. And there he was. Silas Blackwood sat at a large oak table in the center of the cavern, a bottle of whiskey and a single glass before him. He was alone, as if he had been waiting for them. He wasn't dressed as an outlaw now. He wore the fine clothes of a wealthy landowner, his black coat tailored, his boots polished. But the cold, predatory stillness was the same. He looked up as Elias and Cale stepped out of the shadows, their guns drawn. He showed no surprise, only a faint, chilling smile. "Vance," Blackwood said, his voice echoing in the vast cavern. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost. Please join me. We have so much to discuss." "It's over, Blackwood." Elias said, his voice hard. "Your brother's name was Thomas." The smile on Blackwood's face vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He rose slowly from his chair, his eyes burning with a grief that had festered into madness. "You are not worthy to speak his name," he hissed. "You who hide behind a badge and call murder collateral damage. My brother was a good man, a farmer. He had a wife, a baby on the way. He went to the city to buy a gift for her. And he met you." He began to pace his movements like a caged panther. "I read the report, you know. Marshal Vance acted according to protocol. A tragic but necessary outcome. They gave you a commendation. A commendation for murdering my brother." He slammed his fist on the table, the sound cracking through the cavern. "I knew then that their law was a joke. So I decided to seek my own justice. I sold everything we owned. I came west. I built an empire, Vance, all for you. I bought the land my brother had dreamed of settling. I bought the loyalty of men like Sheriff Brody. I built a world where I was the law so that I could finally bring you to justice in a court of my own making. Now, this isn't justice." Elias said, his own voice choked with a guilt he could no longer suppress. "This is revenge. Justice, revenge. They are two words for the same thing," Blackwood roared. "You took my brother, so I decided I would take everything from you. Your peace, your solitude, your name. And then, when you had nothing left, I would take the one thing you still cherished." He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver locket. He held it up, letting it swing gently on its broken chain. "I would take her. I would erase her memory from this world, just as you erased my brother. The revelation shattered the last of Elias's composure. The weight of his sin, a burden he had carried in silence for 3 years, came crashing down on him. He saw it all now, the years of Blackwood's patient, meticulous planning, the depth of his pain, the terrible, unassailable logic of his quest for vengeance. He lowered his gun, his arm suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. His guilt was a physical force, robbing him of his strength, his conviction. He had no right to stop this man. He had created him. Cale, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, stepped forward slightly. He had not lowered his bow. He watched Blackwood, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a profound sadness. "Look at you," Blackwood sneered, seeing the conflict in Elias's face. "The great Marshal Vance broken. This is better than I ever imagined." He made a sharp, sudden movement. Not for a gun, but towards a rope that hung from the ceiling. He pulled it, and a loud bell clanged deep within the mine. The sounds of shouting and running feet echoed from the tunnels. Blackwood's men were coming. "The trial is not over, Vance," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "This was just the sentencing. The execution is yet to come." He smiled, a terrible, broken thing. "And I have arranged a very special audience for your final act." The revelation of Silas Blackwood's true identity left Elias adrift in a sea of guilt. The gun in his hand felt like a brand, a symbol of the life he had unjustly taken. For years he had tried to outrun the memory of Thomas Blackwood's face. But now, standing before his grieving brother, there was nowhere left to run. The second great obstacle of his journey was not Blackwood's army of men converging on the cavern, but the war raging within his own soul. He questioned his right to fight, his right to live, when an innocent man was dead because of him. As Blackwood's men flooded the cavern, Elias stood frozen, a man already defeated. It was Cale who reacted. He loosed an arrow that severed the rope holding a heavy mining cart on an elevated track. The cart, laden with rocks, came crashing down, blocking the main tunnel and creating a chaotic diversion. "Elias, we must move," Kyle yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him back into the shadows of a side tunnel. The spell of guilt was broken by the immediate need for survival. They plunged into the mine's dark labyrinth, the shouts of their pursuers echoing behind them. They found refuge in a small forgotten chamber blocking the entrance with loose rocks. In the suffocating darkness, Elias slumped against the wall, the full weight of his despair crashing down on him. "He's right," Elias said, his voice hollow. "Everything he's done, I started it. I killed his brother." Cale lit a small piece of tinder, the tiny flame, casting flickering shadows on their faces. He looked at Elias, his expression not of judgment, but of profound empathy. "You made a mistake," Cale said, his voice quiet but firm. "You did not intend to kill an innocent man. Blackwood intends to kill many. There is a difference." "What difference does it make to Thomas Blackwood?" Elias countered, his voice ragged with emotion. "He's just as dead." Cale was silent for a long moment. "In my tribe," he began, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence, "we have a legend about 2 wolves. One is the wolf of vengeance. It is nourished by hatred, bitterness, and the memory of pain. The more you feed it, the stronger it grows, until it consumes not only your enemies, but your own heart. The other is the wolf of honor. It is nourished by protecting the living, by seeking balance, and by accepting the burdens of the past without letting them destroy the future. Every man has these 2 wolves fighting inside him." He looked directly at Elias, a small flame reflected in his dark eyes. "Which wolf will you feed, Elias Vance?" The simple, powerful story cut through Elias's fog of guilt. Kyle was not offering absolution or easy answers. He was offering a choice. He could let his past consume him, becoming as twisted by his guilt as Blackwood was by his grief, or he could honor the life he took by protecting other innocent lives. Their moment of reflection was cut short. A rider, having escaped the mine through another exit, galloped to Redemption Creek with new orders. Blackwood, knowing he had broken Elias, mentally escalated his cruel plan. He sent his men into the town, not to rob it, but to take hostages. They seized the town doctor, Dr. Adams, a good man who had treated Elias for a minor injury once, along with his wife and their young daughter. The news reached them through Jedediah, the old prospector who found them hiding in the foothills. Blackwood's gone clean off his rocker. Jedediah reported his face grim. He's taken the Adams family to old Fort Defiance. Sent a message to the sheriff's office. He says he'll execute one of them every hour starting at dawn tomorrow unless you surrender yourself to him. The stakes were now terrifyingly clear. Blackwood was no longer content with destroying Elias's past. He was now threatening to destroy the future of an innocent family. It was a monstrous parallel to Elias's own mistake, a deliberate, cruel twist of the knife. Elias had to save them, not just for their sake, but for his own. It was the only way to truly atone for the life he had taken. It was the only way to feed the right wolf. Fort Defiance. Kyle set his eyes on the horizon. A crumbling ruin, a fitting place for a final stand. The climax of their journey would take place at the abandoned military outpost, a skeletal ruin perched on a windswept mesa. Fort Defiance was a place of ghosts, its decaying timber walls an empty parade ground, a monument to forgotten conflicts. As Elias and Kale approached under the cover of a gathering dusk, the environment itself seemed to join the battle. A sandstorm was brewing on the horizon, a monstrous wall of brown dust that promised to turn the night into a howling, blinding chaos. The wind will be our ally. Kale noted his voice calm as he surveyed the fort from a rocky outcrop. It will cover our sound and our tracks. They could see Blackwood's men, at least a dozen of them posted as sentries along the crumbling ramparts. Lights shone from the commandant's old quarters where the Adams family was being held. The ticking clock was the setting moon. At dawn, Blackwood's ultimatum would expire. Their infiltration was a masterpiece of stealth and coordination. The sandstorm hit with a primal fury, the wind howling like a banshee, whipping sand into a disorienting, stinging curtain. Under its cover, they scaled a section of the fort's rear wall that had partially collapsed, their movements silent and precise. Inside, the storm created a maelstrom of noise and confusion, the groaning of decaying timber and the shriek of the wind, providing a perfect symphony for their grim work. They moved through the fort like phantoms, Kale with his bow and knife, Elias with his bare hands, and his peacemaker used as a last resort. They took down sentries one by one, silent takedowns in the blinding dust, leaving the bodies where they fell. The tension was palpable, each step a gamble, each gust of wind a temporary reprieve. As they neared the commandant's quarters, they paused behind a stack of rotting barrels. It was then that Kyle chose to make his own revelation. "There is something you should know, Elias." He said, his voice low but clear over the storm's roar. "This is not the first time our paths have crossed." Elias turned confused. "What are you talking about?" 3 years ago, I was a scout for the army." Kyle explained, his eyes meeting Elias's in the darkness. "I was there the day after the market shooting. I saw you. I saw the look on your face as you stood over the body of the man you had killed. It was not the face of a killer. It was the face of a man whose soul had been broken. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. When I heard whispers of a former marshal named Vance living in seclusion near Redemption Creek, I sought you out. The day we met at the homestead was not by chance. I wanted to see if the man with the broken soul still had honor. I wanted to see which wolf was winning. The secondary twist landed with quiet force. Kyle had not been a random victim, but a deliberate observer, a quiet judge of his character. Their entire journey had been a test, and Kyle's alliance was the proof that he had so far passed. The bond between them, already strong, was now cemented by a deeper truth. They reached the commandant's quarters. Through a grimy window, they could see the scene inside. Dr. Adams, his wife, and their little girl were tied to chairs. Blackwood stood before them, the silver locket in his hand, his face illuminated by a single lantern. He was tormenting them, telling them about the monster who had brought this doom upon them. Elias and Kale burst through the door, and the windows simultaneously, a whirlwind of calculated violence. In the confusion, Kale cut the hostages free, while Elias faced Blackwood. The final duel was not a quick-draw contest in a dusty street. It was a desperate, brutal fight in a confined space, a battle of ideologies made flesh. "You see Vance?" Blackwood screamed over the storm, lunging at Elias with a Bowie knife. "This is the justice you created, a world where the innocent pay the price." They crashed against the furniture, their fight a raw, desperate struggle. It was a battle between two broken men. Blackwood fought with the furious, wild energy of a man, with nothing left to lose his grief, a source of terrifying strength. Elias fought with a grim, focused determination, the memory of Kale's words echoing in his mind. He was not fighting for revenge. He was fighting to protect the living. The climax came as Blackwood pinned Elias against a wall, the point of his knife inches from his throat. "Now, you will feel the loss I have felt every day for 3 years," he snarled. But in that moment, Elias wasn't thinking of himself. He saw the terrified face of the doctor's little girl huddled with her mother in the corner. He saw the memory of Thomas Blackwood's surprised eyes, and he found a strength not born of hatred, but of a desperate need for redemption. With a final surge of energy, he twisted, disarming Blackwood and sending the knife skittering across the floor. He landed a single precise punch to Blackwood's jaw, and the man crumpled unconscious. The fight was over. Elias had chosen honor. He had fed the right wolf. In the aftermath of the fight, as the sandstorm began to subside with the approaching dawn, Elias stood over the unconscious form of Silas Blackwood. The urge for a final fatal act of vengeance was a tempting whisper in the back of his mind. It would be so easy to end it, to silence the source of so much pain. But as he looked at the terrified but safe faces of the Adams family, he knew that killing Blackwood would make him no better than the man he had just defeated. It would be a final surrender to the wolf of vengeance. He holstered his pistol and instead used rope from the chairs to bind Blackwood securely. Dr. Adams, his voice trembling with gratitude, rushed to his side. "Marshal, Mr. Vance, we owe you our lives." "Just Elias is fine, Doc," he replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. As if on cue, a new group of riders appeared at the fort's entrance. These were not outlaws. They were territorial marshals led by a stern-faced, gray-bearded judge. They had been summoned by a message sent by Dr. Adams's assistant in Redemption Creek, a young man who had ridden 60 miles straight after witnessing the kidnapping. The law, the real law, had finally arrived. Elias presented the bound Silas Blackwood to the judge, along with the evidence they had gathered from the records office. Blackwood's empire, built on fear and grief, crumbled in the light of the rising sun. He was exposed not as a powerful cattle baron, but as a broken man, twisted by hate. His arrest and the subsequent legal proceedings would dismantle his power in the region far more effectively than a bullet ever could. It was a more meaningful defeat, forcing him to live with the failure of his all-consuming revenge. As the marshals led Blackwood away, he regained consciousness. His eyes, no longer burning with manic fire, were now hollow, empty vessels of despair. He looked at Elias, a flicker of bewildered understanding on his face. He had lost. Elias freed the hostages, his actions speaking a louder truth than any words of apology ever could. He had saved 3 innocent lives, a small but significant step on the long road to atoning for the one he had taken. He found Kyle by the fort's outer wall, staring out at the sunrise painting the desert in hues of gold and purple. The world felt clean, washed new by the storm. "Your path is clear now," Kyle said without turning. "What about yours?" Elias asked. "My people are scattered." Kyle replied, a note of sadness in his voice. "But they are not gone. I will find them. I will help them rebuild." He turned to face Elias, a rare small smile on his lips. "You have fed the wolf of honor, Elias Vance. Do not let it starve." There was nothing more to say. Their shared journey was over. They had saved each other in more ways than one. They clasped forearms, a gesture of profound respect and brotherhood that transcended their different worlds. Then Kale turned and melted back into the wilderness, his path diverging from Elias's once more. Months later, the land was beginning to heal. Redemption Creek, freed from Blackwood's corrupting influence, was slowly finding its footing. Elias returned not as a hero or a pariah, but simply as a quiet man who had faced his demons and emerged whole. The townsfolk, now aware of the full story, treated him with a newfound respectful distance. He recovered his wife's silver locket from the territorial evidence locker, its surface now dented and scratched from the final battle. The final scene of his long trial took place on a peaceful sunlit ridge overlooking his small, secluded ranch. A single simple wooden cross marked the grave of his wife Sarah. The air was warm, filled with the scent of sage and the sound of birdsong. For the first time in years, the silence felt like peace, not punishment. He took out the locket and opened it, looking at the tiny, perfect image of Sarah's smiling face. For so long, this object had been a symbol of his loss, a heavy anchor to a past defined by grief and guilt. He had clung to it, believing it was all he had left. But now he understood. He no longer needed a silver trinket to remember her love, and he no longer needed to punish himself for his past mistakes. His atonement was not in endless mourning, but in living a life worthy of the honor he had fought so hard to reclaim. With a gentle reverence, he placed the locket on the wooden cross, leaving it there to glint in the warm afternoon sun. The act was a release, a letting go. He was no longer a prisoner of his past. He turned to his horse Cicero and swung into the saddle. He looked at his small homestead, a place of quiet exile, one last time. Then, instead of riding toward it, he turned his horse away. He faced the vast open horizon, a landscape of endless possibility. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a very long time, he was riding toward a future, not away from a past.